Welcome to our podcast, "'Tis But a Scratch, Fact and Fiction." Today's episode, The Holy Grail, from medieval romance to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, by way of Nazis and the Da Vinci Code.
Ask yourself, why do you seek the cup of Christ? Is it for his glory or for yours?
Despite those stirring movie soundbites, I will not be searching for the Holy Grail in this episode. All such quests would be fruitless. The Holy Grail is a medieval literary fiction that has passed into popular culture along with King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Over the last 2 centuries, however, some have taken that fiction seriously and transformed the Grail into the stuff of conspiracy theories. In the 1930s, the Nazis took it to be a mystic symbol of Aryan purity, protected by the medieval Cathar heretics or the Knights Templar. More recently, 3 would-be historians and a popular novelist claimed to have decoded the mystery of the Grail, revealing it to be a secret metaphor for the bloodline of Jesus and Mary Magdalene that became the Merovingian dynasty of the Franks. It isn't. The Grail is, as it was, just a good story about the quest for meaning and human perfection. What most people know about the Holy Grail is summed up pretty well in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade.
The Holy Grail, Dr. Jones. The chalice used by Christ during the Last Supper. The cup that caught his blood at the crucifixion and was entrusted to Joseph of Arimathea.
I would add to this that it is hidden, has magical powers, and only the pure of heart can ever achieve it. This sounds like a story that comes from the Bible, but it isn't. The cup from which Jesus drank at the Last Supper is mentioned in the New Testament. In Paul's letter to the Corinthians, and in all of the Gospels except for John's, Jesus passes his cup to his disciples, telling them to drink from it, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. The cup, however, does not reappear in the New Testament, nor do we find a reference to the Holy Grail in any early Christian writing. It appears neither in the non-canonical Gospels nor in the writings of the patristic fathers. So when do we first find a reference to the Grail? For that we have to wait until the late 12th century, more than 1100 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. The earliest reference to a magical Grail occurs in Chrétien de Troyes' romance Perceval, or the Story of the Grail, composed for the court of the Count of Flanders sometime between 1180 and 1190. Those who listen to our second episode will recognize this as a source for Eric Romer's truly strange film, Perceval le Gallois.
Car en les forêts solitaires, plus s'y connaît qu'en plate terre.
Although this is the fundamental text for all subsequent tales about the Grail, it is questionable whether one should call this Grail holy. In Chrétien's story, the young and naive knight Perceval is given lodgings by the lame fisher king. As Perceval sits on a bed with his host, he witnesses a strange procession of handsome young men and a beautiful maiden carrying mysterious objects past them into a chamber. The first is a shining white lance that bleeds from its tip. This is followed by boys carrying 2 gold candelabras, each with 10 blazing candles, accompanied by a beautifully adorned damsel carrying a golden grail set with the most precious gems that shine so brightly as to eclipse the candles. The last object is a silver carving tray carried by another beautiful maiden. Perceval is amazed by the procession and wants to ask about it, but remains silent. He remembers that the noble man who instructed him in the ways of chivalry had warned him against speaking too much. He thinks that he will ask one of the servants in the morning. This turns out to be a disastrous decision. When Perceval awakens, he is alone, and as he leaves the castle, it vanishes behind him. A hideous, wild woman then rides up and curses him, telling him that if he had asked about these objects, the Fisher King would have been healed.
À Perceval, quel grand malheur que tu te tusses, car si demandé le lui eusse, le bon roi qui malade gît fut de sa blessure guéri. Et sache donc que maint ennui adviendra à toi et autrui, trouver ton chemin ne pourra, longues années tu erreras. Quand tu parviendras chez ta mère, elle sera déjà en terre.
Perceval, cursed is he who in fine weather waits for finer weather still. That's what you did, wretch. You knew to speak, yet remained silent. Cursed was your silence. If only you had asked, the good king of his illness would have been cured. Adversity awaits you and your kin. You'll lose your way, an errant ride for many years. When you reach your mother, in the earth she'll lie. 5 years later, Perceval learns from the hermit, who turns out to be his mother's brother, that the Grail carries a single consecrated host, which is the only food that has sustained the Fisher King's father, Perceval's grandfather, for 12 years. The hermit also tells Perceval his mother died from grief because of his absence, and because of this sin he was unable to ask the questions that would have cured the Fisher King. Perceval promises to do penance and takes communion with the hermit. And that's it. Chrétien never finished this poem. His choice of the word grail, Old French graal, is interesting. It could mean a cup, but it could also mean a dish, a plate, or a bowl. In Chrétien's tale, the Grail is not filled with wine, that is, the blood of Christ, as one would expect based on the popular conception of the Holy Grail as a cup, but has a single consecrated communion wafer resting in it. That is, the body of Christ. It seems to me that Chrétien's Graal is not a cup. It is much more likely to be a paten, a dish or a bowl used to carry consecrated communion wafers. The early 13th century German poet, Wolfram von Eschenbach, who based his Parzival on Chrétien's poem, was so uncertain what a grail was that he turned it into a gemstone that had the power of renewing the life of the phoenix, a power given it by a consecrated host brought down from heaven on Good Friday by a dove shining with brilliant light. Wolfram transformed Chrétien's Grail into the legendary philosopher's stone, the Holy Grail of alchemists. Wolfram's work is extremely important because it was the basis for Wagner's opera Parzival, and through that became a favorite of the Nazis, as we will later see. So where did Chrétien get the idea for the Grail? I suspect that it comes from the same place that he got the character of Sir Lancelot and the love affair between Lancelot and Queen Guinevere. In other words, he made it up. Some have tried to argue that Chrétien drew upon the Welsh medieval legend of Brian the Blessed and his magic cauldron that could restore the dead to life, but it would take a lot of stretching of the parallels to make this plausible. As I said, it's more likely that Chrétien's Grail is a paten, a small gold dish upon which the consecrated communion wafer is placed, and that it is the consecrated host rather than the vessel that is important. When Chrétien was writing, the Mass was developing into the central ritual of the Catholic Church. In 1215, at the Fourth Lateran Council, Pope Innocent III declared that during the Mass, the consecrated communion wafer became the actual body of Christ, and the wine the blood of Christ. This is the Catholic Church's doctrine of transubstantiation. Chrétien's Perceval was an immediate hit, and several trouvères were drawn to it by its very incompleteness. Over the next 50 years, 4 continuators completed the tale, But the troubadour most responsible for adding the holy to the Holy Grail was a younger contemporary of Chrétien, Robert of Boron, who around the year 1200 wrote 3 poems tracing the history of the Grail from the crucifixion down to the time of King Arthur. For Robert of Boron, the Grail was indeed the cup of Christ, in which Joseph of Arimathea caught the blood of Christ from his bleeding corpse when he was taken down from the cross. In an era of relic hunting made into a craze by the Crusades, Boron turned the Grail into the holiest of relics, and it was a relic that could be found relatively nearby, for Joseph had taken Christ's cup to Britain, to Glastonbury. There he became its first protector, a role taken up in successive generations of his bloodline. Perceval, as it turns out, belonged to this lineage on his mother's side. Galahad and the quest for the Grail were introduced a couple of decades later in the highly popular Old French Vulgate, or Lancelot Grail cycle. This consists of a connected series of prose histories about King Arthur and his knights. One of these told of the quest for the Grail by the Knights of the Round Table. The Vulgate cycle was condensed and tightened up to form what literary scholars imaginatively term the post-Vulgate cycle, which eliminates much of the Lancelot-Guinevere affair to focus on the quest for the Grail. These works are anonymous, and the Vulgate cycle probably had several authors, but there is a strong suggestion that the Vulgate's quest for the Grail was written either by a Cistercian monk or a secular author who had been educated in a Cistercian monastery. The hero of the Grail story is no longer Perceval, but Lancelot's son Galahad, who turns out to be of the lineage of Joseph of Arimathea on his mother's side. Chaste and ascetic, Galahad is fashioned in the image of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux's ideal Miles Christi, Knight of Christ. It is to the Vulgate cycle that we owe the adventures of the individual Knights of the Round Table during their quest, and the culmination of the quest in 3 knights, Bors, Perceval, and Galahad, being granted a vision of the Grail, and the perfect knight, Galahad, being allowed to hold the Grail, having achieved perfect earthly joy. Galahad prays that he might die, and God grants his prayer. He ascends to heaven, carried by angels. Stories about King Arthur and his knights, the so-called Matter of Britain, were wildly popular throughout Western Europe in the late Middle Ages. About 200 manuscripts of parts of the Vulgate cycle still exist. This may not sound like very much, but in terms of medieval manuscript survival, that makes it easily equivalent to the works of Stephen King. Arthur also makes his way into medieval chronicles and histories. The mania for things Arthurian among the European aristocracy led to the fashion for round table tournaments, in which participants were costumed as various Arthurian characters, sort of like today's Renaissance fairs. In the 1460s, an English knight, Sir Thomas Malory, while languishing in prison for theft and horse stealing, combined and synthesized and unified the stories about King Arthur and his knights into a single masterwork, Le Mort d'Arthur, The Death of Arthur, which William Caxton in 1485 made one of the first books to appear in print in England. Ironically, Malory, who multiple times was accused and imprisoned for theft, extortion, highway robbery, kidnapping, and rape, became the spokesman for chivalry. In his account, the origin of the quest for the Holy Grail came during Pentecost, when Arthur and his knights were dining in his hall. A vision of the Grail, hidden under a silk covering, suddenly appears in a blinding beam of light. In this light, the knights appear to each other to be younger and fitter. All are struck dumb in wonder, as the hall is filled with the smell of their favorite food and drink. Then the Grail disappeared as suddenly as it appeared. Arthur offered thanks to God for the blessing of the vision, but Gawain desired more. He swore that he would not return to court until he had seen the Grail uncovered. He was followed by others until 150 knights took the oath. Malory's author is not delighted by this, but saddened. He sees in this quest the end of the Fellowship of the Round Table. Malory's Grail is that of the Vulgate cycle, the cup of Christ brought to Britain by Joseph of Arimathea and protected since by his line. And as in the Vulgate version, the only knights to succeed in the quest are Bors, Percival, and of course Galahad. Malory is the source for virtually all modern English language retellings of the Arthurian legend, including the quest for the Holy Grail. Medieval historian Richard Barber, author of the Holy Grail, Imagination and Belief, probably the single best work on this subject, observes that Malory saw the Grail as both a relic in itself and as a container of a relic, the blood of Christ. This might reflect Malory's own piety. Malory's estate in Warwickshire was within 30 miles of the Abbey of Hales, which in his day was one of the most popular pilgrimage sites in Britain because of its possession of a holy relic, the blood of Christ. The emphasis in these tales upon the vision of the Holy Grail makes sense when one understands that throughout the Middle Ages, laymen rarely participated in communion. Rather, they observed it and adored it. The great Romanesque and Gospel cathedrals were the stage upon which this theater was performed. In 1215, at the Fourth Lateran Council, Pope Innocent III required all Christians to take communion once a year at Easter. But the communion that laymen would take was only under one species, the bread. The wine, that is the blood of Christ, was reserved for the clergy. As Richard Barber notes, the remoteness and inaccessibility of the Grail is paralleled by the remoteness of the Eucharist for the ordinary worshipper. Despite its widespread popularity, the story of the Grail does not seem to have been taken very seriously in the Middle Ages. Relic hunting and collection were a mania, and forging relics became a cottage industry. Jean Calvin remarked that if one were to gather together all the fragments of the true cross housed in various churches and monasteries throughout Europe, they would fill a ship. By contrast, no cathedral of the High Middle Ages claimed to possess the Holy Grail. In 1437, King Alfonso V, the Magnanimous of Aragon, gave to Valencia Cathedral, in lieu of payment of a debt, a cup that he said was the very vessel used by Jesus at the Last Supper. The Valencia Chalice has been venerated down to modern times. Two recent popes, John Paul II and Benedict XVI, celebrated Mass with it during their visits to Valencia. The cup is made from a deep red agate stone from the Middle East. An art historian has identified the chalice as a product of an Egyptian, Syrian, or Palestinian workshop sometime between the 4th century BC and the 1st century AD. Churchmen of the cathedral subsequently provided a history for the chalice, claiming that St. Lawrence, a native of Spain, sent it to his hometown of Huesca to protect it from Valerian's persecution of the Christians in 258. It's interesting that the Valencia Chalice was never called the Holy Grail, even though stories of the quest were well known in late medieval Spain, and it was never attributed mystical powers. Unlike Santiago de Compostela, Valencia Cathedral was not a major destination for pilgrimage before the modern era. There are several other candidates, all of them modern, one of which is housed today in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. We'll return to that one at the end of this talk. The paucity of claimed relics of the Grail is probably because neither relic hunters nor forgers saw profit in a quest for the Grail. and despite its popularity in literature, the Holy Grail is conspicuously absent from the writings of medieval churchmen. The medieval accounts of the Holy Grail shaped modern Arthurian literature, from Alfred Lord Tennyson's The Idylls of the King to T.H. White's magnificent The Once and Future King. These authors treat the quest for the Grail as a fictional story. Others in the 19th and 20th centuries did not. For them, the Grail is real and is often part of a conspiracy that has persisted for centuries. Since the 19th century, the Grail has been associated with the crusading order of the Knights Templar, suppressed in 1307, with Freemasons who themselves claim a link to the Templars, with Rosicrucians, with secret occult societies, and with the medieval dualist heretics of southern France known as the Cathars. The last brings us to the Grail and Nazis. Steven Spielberg in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, as he did in Raiders of the Lost Ark, took as his starting point the belief that the Nazis were scouring the world for mystic objects that they believed to possess supernatural powers. As with many myths, there is a kernel of truth to this. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsfuhrer of the SS, was fascinated by both the occult and medieval Germanic legends. He even established an SS think tank, the Ahnenerbe, the Ancestral Heritage Foundation, made up of scholars, archaeologists, and, toward the end, doctors who conducted grisly experiments detailed at the Nuremberg trials. The Ahnenerbe was the propaganda arm of the SS. Its mission was to establish Aryan superiority. In support of it, it funded expeditions as far away as Tibet to search for ancient Aryan artifacts. Himmler was particularly taken with a young amateur folklorist and would-be archaeologist named Otto Rahn. Rahn had published a book that greatly impressed Himmler, Crusade Against the Grail, The Struggle Against the Cathars. Rahn, who like Himmler, loved the story of Parsifal, argued that the early 13th century poet Walter von Eschenbach had the real scoop about the Holy Grail. If one reads his Parsifal closely and correctly, it is clear that Wolfram was writing about real people and a real place, Occitan, that is, southern France. Mont Salvat, the fortress of the Grail in Parsifal, was a thinly disguised reference to Montségur, the last great Cathar stronghold that was destroyed in the year 1244 by crusaders from northern France. Rahn, following von Eschenbach, concluded that the Grail was not Christ's cup, as in the French version of the story, but actually a stone that had fallen from the skies, a sort of Cathar version of the Kaaba stone in Mecca. Rahn believed that the Grail had been kept by the Cathars at Montségur and was hidden there before the castle fell to the Crusaders. Himmler was so impressed with Rahn that he made him an SS staff officer and financed an archaeological expedition to Montségur, a sort of Nazi quest for the Grail. Rahn chronicled this expedition in his second book, Lucifer's Court, A Heretic's Journey in Search of Light. What made Rahn's ideas particularly attractive to Himmler was that Rahn had no use for either Jews or contemporary Christianity, especially the Catholic Church. The Cathars, who like Jesus were Aryans, preserved in their variety of Christianity an older, more masculine pagan Aryan religion. They worshiped Lucifer, the true God of the New Testament, in opposition to Yahweh, the evil God of the Old Testament. For Rahn, Yahweh represented the Jews and, by extension, contemporary Christians. Lucifer represented the pure Nordic race and culture. The Grail was a symbol of the latter. By 1939, Rahn, who had been punished for his open sexuality by being assigned to duty at a concentration camp, repudiated Nazism and resigned from the SS. A few weeks later, he was found frozen to death on a mountain trail. Rahn was an experienced mountaineer, and the trail was not all that difficult. It is likely that he committed suicide. One did not resign from the SS. Himmler continued to be interested in the Grail, and in 1940 made a trip to Montserrat Abbey near Barcelona, another candidate for Wolfram's Mont Salvat. The Grail wasn't there. Hitler himself had little use for occultism and what he regarded as superstitious nonsense. But like Himmler and Ron, Hitler loved Richard Wagner's Parzival. For Hitler, the Grail was not an object but a symbol. He compared the Nazis to a brotherhood of Templars around the Grail of pure blood. In 1982, Henry Lincoln, a scriptwriter for the BBC, Michael Bajan, a photojournalist, and Richard Lee, a novelist, made an original, if a bit silly, contribution to the story of the Grail in a book that they entitled The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail, they posited, was neither a cup nor a stone, observing that the old French word Saint Grail could be parsed either as Saint Grail, Holy Grail, or Sang Real, royal blood. They claimed that the Holy Grail was a reference to both the womb of Mary Magdalene, the wife of Jesus, and to the bloodline for which she was the vessel. That Jesus and Mary Magdalene were husband and wife was not a new idea. It is implied in some Gnostic Gospels and was a Catholic belief if we give credence to the Catholic authors who described the heresy and denounced it. What was new is their discovery that Mary Magdalene, pregnant with Jesus' child, fled to southern France. Centuries later, their descendants would intermarry with the Merovingian dynasty of the Franks. Although conventional historians believed that the Merovingian dynasty had died out, Lincoln, Bajan, and Lee argued that it had survived through the line of King Dagobert II and, in fact, continued to this day. The Albigensian Crusade was not a holy war against the Catholic heresy, but an attempt by the Catholic Church to exterminate this lineage which threatened the Church's legitimacy. Nevertheless, Jesus' bloodline survived because of the efforts of a secret society, the Priory of Sion, founded by the first ruler of the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem, Godfrey of Bouillon. The Priory of Sion worked behind the scenes to create the Templars as their military arm. Although small in number, the Priory could boast among its Grand Masters such notables as Leonardo da Vinci, Isaac Newton, Victor Hugo, and Debussy. The mission of the Priory was and remained to protect and preserve the Merovingian bloodline of Christ, with the ultimate goal of restoring it to its rightful place on the thrones of France and the Holy Roman Empire. The authors of The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail constructed their argument with care, piecing together bits of evidence that at first seemed unrelated and disparate. They were, in fact, unrelated and disparate. Among the works that they pulled into their orbit was the notorious Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which turned out not to have been a Russian Tsarist forgery to justify pogroms against the Jews, but the perversion of an authentic Priory of Sion document outlining the goals of the organization. All of this is nonsense. The house of cards constructed by the authors stood upon and was fashioned from misreadings of texts and, above all, an elaborate hoax. The Priory of Sion did exist, but it was founded in 1956 by Pierre Plantard, a shady character who had a history of forming right-wing Catholic ultra-nationalist, anti-Semitic, and anti-Masonic associations. He had been a fervent supporter of the Vichy regime and the German occupation during World War II. After the war, he claimed that he was, in fact, a resistance fighter. He was initiated into the Freemasons and became a fervent supporter of Charles de Gaulle. Plantard was above all a con man, and the Priory of Sion was to be his master con. The French government required all new fraternal associations be officially registered. Plantard explained in the document that the organization was to be based in a commune close to the border with Geneva and took its name from a nearby hill, Mount Sion, where they would establish a spiritual retreat. The statutes of the Priory of Sion described it as a traditionalist Catholic chivalric order to help the Catholic Church to teach truth and to defend the weak and oppressed. All of this was a front for Plantard's real purpose, to create an organization modeled upon the Freemasons that would enrich him. He took advantage of another hoax, a supposed treasure in the village of Rennes-le-Château in the foothills of the Pyrenees, concocted by a local restaurateur to encourage tourism. That hoax claimed that Blanche of Castile had deposited a treasure in the village and that the local parish priest, Father Berengar Saunière, at the end of the 19th century had discovered evidence for it in old documents stuffed inside a hollow column in his church. Plantard absorbed this hoax into his own one. Among those documents, he claimed, were texts stretching back to the Middle Ages that proved that the Merovingian dynasty had not died out, but had survived through the line of Dagobert II, who had been assassinated or martyred in 679, and that the Priory of Sion was an offshoot of the Abbey of the Mount Sion, established in 1099 by Godfrey of Bouillon, the first ruler of the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem, with the secret purpose of protecting the hidden Merovingian line. Plantard and a friend, Philippe de Chérizy, supported these claims by forging a series of documents that they smuggled into the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. Among these documents was a fake genealogy of Plantard that showed him to be the senior male of the Merovingian bloodline and hence possibly the great monarch predicted by Nostradamus who would unite all of Europe under his rule. The story was then turned into a book, The Gold of France, by another friend, Gerard de Sède, which reproduced some of these forged documents. That book was read by Henry Lincoln, who saw in it an exciting subject for documentaries for the BBC Two program Chronicles. The success of these documentaries led Lincoln to contact his friends Bagent and Lee about collaborating on a book that turned out to be The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. The authors cobbled together Plantard's concocted story about the Priory of Sion with the idea that Jesus and Mary Magdalene had married and had children, which had been argued in a then recent best-selling work of nonfiction, and the fake etymology of Sang Grail as Sang Real, royal blood, first proposed by an obscure contemporary of Mallory who believed it referred to the secret royal lineage of Galahad. The result was a best-selling work of pseudo-history, which ironically Pierre Plantard did not profit from, which I take as evidence for cosmic justice. Dan Brown, however, did. And those of you who have either read his 1982 novel, The Da Vinci Code, or have seen the movie starring Tom Hanks, will immediately recognize the source of Brown's great reveal about the Holy Grail being both the womb of Mary and the bloodline of Jesus. Given the novel's title, it is not surprising that the key to the great mystery is found in a painting by Leonardo da Vinci, whom the authors of the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail had identified as one of the Grand Masters of the Priory of Sion. That painting is Da Vinci's The Last Supper. In the movie adaptation of the Da Vinci Code, the great reveal is given to the novel's Grail expert, Sir Lee Trebring.
Wait, please. You're saying the Holy Grail is a person? A woman?
And it turns out she makes an appearance. Right there.
But they're all men.
Are they? What about that figure on the right hand of our Lord, seated in the place of honor? Flowing red hair, folded feminine hands, hint of a bosom, no? My dear, that's Mary Magdalene.
The prostitute?
She was no such thing. Mary Magdalene was Jesus' wife.
The novel's hero, Robert Langdon, a Harvard University professor of religious symbology, a discipline I actually had never heard of before, responds that there is no hard evidence for that identification. And he's right. The figure identified as Mary Magdalene is actually the Apostle John, who by tradition was a mere youth at the time of the Last Supper, and that is how Leonardo portrayed him. Of course, in the novel and the movie, Robert Langdon will discover that Sebring is right and all of those art historians were wrong. If The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail had been a bestseller, the Da Vinci Code was a literary phenomenon, selling over 80 million copies within 20 years of its publication. Besant and Lee, without the support of Lincoln, decided that they should share in the wealth, since it was their research that Brown had used as the framework for his novel, and they brought an infringement of copyright suit against him and his publisher Random House. Brown in his testimony implausibly claimed that he had not read The Holy Blood until well into the writing of his novel. Besant and Lee's lawyers pointed out that the name of the Grail expert in the book, Lee Sebring, was made up of Lee's last name and an anagram of Besant. Ultimately, however, the suit failed because, as the judge stated, The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail claimed to be a work of history, and one cannot copyright historical facts or suppositions. Finally, we come to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In 1950, the museum bought for its medieval branch, the Cloisters, a chalice that had been touted as the authentic Holy Grail. It isn't. Art historians now date it to the 6th century. It may not even be a chalice, as scholars have recently suggested that it resembles more the bowl of a standing lamp from that period. The reason I mention this pretender to the title of the Holy Grail is so that I can give a plug to the Met Cloisters. Located in Fort Tryon Park in Manhattan overlooking the Hudson River and modeled on a 12th century abbey, the Cloisters is a must-see for anyone interested in the Middle Ages. It is also one of the special places for me and my wife, Ellen. Of all the retellings of the Grail story, the one that most sticks with me is T.H. White's in The Once and Future King. He includes this in the part about Lancelot, which he entitled The Ill-Made Knight. Lancelot does not achieve the Grail. As in Mallory, that honor belongs to his son Galahad. The reason is that Lancelot is a flawed human being. The ill-made knight spends his life striving to be a good man, performing noble deeds, but he's always conscious of the pride and cruelty that he tries to overcome. He loves Arthur and he loves God, but he cannot repudiate his great love for Guinevere, even though he knows it is sinful. Lancelot, in other words, is a human being. The Grail is a symbol of human perfection, and only angels, such as Galahad, can achieve it.